The Battle of Tours, how 30,000 Franks stopped 80,000 Umayyad Muslims and saved Christian Europe. Before we dive into one of the most consequential battles in European history, let me ask you something. What happens when two civilizations, each convinced they're destined to dominate the world, collide on a battlefield where the outcome will determine whether Europe remains Christian or becomes Islamic? What happens when disciplined infantry refuses to break against cavalry charges that have conquered from India to Spain, when a brilliant tactician sacrifices mobility for endurance, when a single death can shatter the morale of an entire army? You're about to find out. And if you think you know this story because you've heard that Charles Martel saved Europe, I promise you don't know it like this. No crusader mythology, no clean civilizational narratives. Just the tactics, the geography, the decisions, and the brutal reality of what happened when 30,000 Frankish warriors stood their ground against the most powerful military force of the 8th century and refused to move. If this is the kind of history you're here for, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what medieval battle I should cover next. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back to October 732 AD, to somewhere between Tours and Poitiers in central France, where the future of Western Europe would be decided in 7 days of maneuvering and 1 day of slaughter. The Umayyad Caliphate in 732 was the largest empire on earth. It had exploded out of Arabia a century earlier, united by the new religion of Islam and led by military genius and religious fervor. Within 80 years, Muslim armies had conquered the Persian Empire, torn away the wealthiest provinces of the Byzantine Empire, taken North Africa, crossed into Spain, and destroyed the Visigothic kingdom. By 720, all of Iberia, except the northern mountains, was under Muslim control, renamed Al-Andalus. It was not just military conquest. Islamic civilization was at its cultural and scientific peak, preserving Greek philosophy, advancing mathematics and astronomy, building cities and universities, while Christian Europe struggled through the chaos of the post-Roman world. But alongside the culture and learning was an empire that expanded through jihad, holy war, where conquest was both religious duty and profitable enterprise. Raids into Francia, the Frankish kingdom north of the Pyrenees, had been ongoing for years, testing defenses, seizing plunder, probing for weakness. By 732, the Umayyad governor of Al-Andalus, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, decided it was time for something larger, a full-scale invasion. Abdul Rahman was an experienced general and administrator, appointed governor after his predecessor had been killed in a failed raid into Aquitaine years earlier. He understood that raiding alone would not secure Muslim control north of the Pyrenees. What was needed was conquest, the establishment of permanent Muslim presence in Francia, control of the wealthy churches and monasteries that dotted the Frankish landscape. The immediate target was the Basilica of Saint Martin of Tours, one of the richest religious sites in Western Europe, filled with gold, silver, relics, and treasures accumulated over centuries. It was also symbolically important, the burial place of Saint Martin, one of the most revered figures in Gallic Christianity. Taking and looting Tours would send a message that Christian Francia was as vulnerable as Christian Hispania had been. The army Abdul Rahman assembled was enormous by 8th century standards. Estimates range from 50,000 to 80,000 men, though the higher numbers are likely exaggerated. A reasonable estimate is 60 to 70,000, a massive force for the period. The core was Berber cavalry from North Africa, light horsemen armed with lances, swords, and composite bows, incredibly mobile, trained to charge, wheel away, and charge again. There were also Arab cavalry, heavier, more disciplined, elite units that formed the army's shock force. Infantry included Syrian, Egyptian, and Berber contingents, less emphasized in Umayyad tactics but necessary for sieges and holding ground. The army also included a massive baggage train because Abdul Rahman intended this to be a campaign of conquest, not just a raid. Siege equipment, supplies, and space for the plunder they expected to seize. It was an army designed for mobile warfare, for sweeping across open country, overwhelming static defenses, and living off the land. The invasion began in the spring of 732. Abdul Rahman crossed the Pyrenees, moving through Basque territory and into Aquitaine, the southern Frankish duchy ruled by Odo, also called Eudes, Duke of Aquitaine. Odo was semi-independent from the Frankish king, ruling Aquitaine more as his own kingdom than as a subject territory. He had clashed with Muslim raiders before and had even briefly allied with a Berber rebel against the Umayyads in a failed attempt to create a buffer state in the Pyrenees. That alliance had collapsed, and now Abdul Rahman's invasion was partly retribution for Odo's interference. The Umayyad army moved north, capturing and sacking Bordeaux, one of the major cities of Aquitaine. Odo gathered his forces and met the Muslims in battle somewhere near the Garonne River. It was a disaster. The Aquitanian army was shattered, casualties were massive, and Odo barely escaped with his life. The road to the Loire Valley to Tours was open. Odo, desperate, did something he had resisted for years. He appealed for help to Charles, the mayor of the palace of the Frankish kingdom. Charles was not a king, not officially, but he was the effective ruler of Francia. The Merovingian kings, descendants of Clovis, who had founded the Frankish kingdom 2 centuries earlier, were figureheads, powerless. Real power rested with the mayor of the palace, a position Charles had seized through political maneuvering and military force. Charles was in his mid-40s in 732, a veteran of decades of internal warfare, brutal campaigns against rival Frankish nobles, Germanic tribes on the eastern frontier, and constant struggle to hold the fractured Frankish kingdom together. He was called Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, a nickname earned through his relentless, crushing military campaigns. He was not a man of mercy or subtlety. He was a pragmatist who understood power. Charles saw the Umayyad invasion as both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was existential. If Abdul Rahman conquered Aquitaine and moved north, the wealthy monasteries and bishoprics of northern Francia would be next. The Frankish kingdom could collapse, but the opportunity was equally significant. If Charles defeated the invaders, he would be the savior of Christian Europe. His political position would be unassailable, and Aquitaine, which had resisted his authority, would be forced into submission. Charles mobilized the Frankish army, a process that took weeks. The Frankish military system was based on free landholders who owed military service, and gathering them from across the kingdom required messengers, organization, and logistical preparation. But Charles also innovated. He relied heavily on his personal retainers, professional warriors who fought for pay and plunder rather than feudal obligation. This made his army more responsive, more disciplined, more willing to campaign in the autumn when traditional levies wanted to go home for harvest. The Frankish army that marched south numbered approximately 30,000 men, possibly slightly more. The vast majority were infantry. Frankish warriors fought on foot, equipped with spears, axes, swords, shields, and some armor, mail or leather depending on wealth. They were not organized in formal units like Roman legions, but in warbands based on kinship, region, or loyalty to a lord. What made them effective was discipline, the ability to hold formation under pressure, and sheer physical toughness. Frankish warriors were expected to stand in a shield wall and fight for hours if necessary, enduring cavalry charges, arrow volleys, and hand-to-hand combat without breaking. There was also a small Frankish cavalry contingent, maybe 2,000 to 3,000 mounted warriors, but they were not the main striking force. Frankish military doctrine was defensive infantry tactics: hold ground, absorb attacks, wait for the enemy to exhaust themselves, then counterattack. It was not glamorous, but it worked. Charles's strategy was to intercept the Umayyad army before it reached Tours. He force-marched his army south, covering ground at a punishing pace, and positioned himself somewhere between Tours and Poitiers, on the road Abdul Rahman would have to take. The exact location of the battlefield is unknown. Sources are frustratingly vague. but it was likely in a forested area with open ground, terrain that would limit the mobility of Muslim cavalry and favor infantry defense. Charles chose the ground carefully, positioning his army on a hill or ridge with forests protecting the flanks, forcing Abdul Rahman to attack uphill across open ground. It was a textbook defensive position. Abdul Rahman arrived and found the Frankish army blocking his path. He had not expected serious resistance this far south, certainly not an army as large as the one Charles had brought. The sources, Christian and Muslim, suggest Abdul Rahman was confident, perhaps overconfident. His cavalry had never been stopped by infantry in a pitched battle. They had destroyed Gothic armies in Spain, Byzantine forces in the east, Aquitanian levies at Bordeaux. Why would Frankish infantry be different? But Abdul Rahman was also cautious. He did not attack immediately. For 7 days, the two armies faced each other, skirmishing, probing, testing. Light cavalry raids against the Frankish flanks, trying to draw them out of their defensive position. The Franks refused to move. Charles understood that his only advantage was terrain and formation. If he allowed his infantry to be drawn into open ground, the Muslim cavalry would destroy them. So they waited. The waiting was psychological warfare. The Franks stood in formation day after day, watching the Muslim cavalry ride back and forth, watching the arrows fall, watching their flanks being tested. It required iron discipline, men standing in armor, shields raised, not reacting, not breaking ranks. Some skirmishes turned into brief, vicious fights when Muslim cavalry charged too close and Frankish infantry counterattacked with axes and spears. But the line held. Abdul Rahman, meanwhile, faced a logistical problem. His massive army needed food and forage, and the longer they sat in place, the more supplies they consumed. His men were also getting restless, eager for the plunder of Tours, frustrated by the Frankish refusal to fight in the open. By the 7th day, Abdul Rahman made his decision. He would attack, break the Frankish infantry through sheer weight of numbers and the shock of cavalry charges, then continue north to Tours. On October 10, 732, the Battle of Tours began. The Umayyad cavalry formed up, thousands of horsemen, the finest light and medium cavalry in the world, arranged in waves. The plan was straightforward: charge the Frankish line, break it, shatter the formations, then ride down the fleeing infantry. The first wave charged uphill at the Frankish center. The Franks locked shields, planted their feet, braced their spears. The Muslim cavalry hit the shield wall like a wave against a cliff. Horses reared, crashed into the wall of shields and spears. Men were thrown from their saddles, speared, dragged down. The Franks held. The cavalry wheeled away, regrouped, charged again, and again, and again. The fighting went on for hours. Wave after wave of cavalry charges crashed into the Frankish line, and each time the line bent, men were killed, gaps opened, but the line did not break. The shield wall, the phalanx of spears, the sheer mass of men standing shoulder to shoulder, absorbed the shock. This was what Frankish infantry did. They stood. Muslim cavalry tactics, brilliant against lighter infantry or in open terrain, could not break a disciplined formation that refused to panic. The Franks fought with axes and spears, short stabbing swords, pulling riders from horses, killing mounts, turning the battlefield into a chaos of bodies and broken weapons. Abdul Rahman, seeing his cavalry charges failing, committed more forces, shifting units to try to find weak points in the Frankish flanks. Charles reinforced the threatened sections, moving reserves, keeping the line intact. The battle became a test of endurance. Who would break first? The Frankish infantry, exhausted from holding formation under constant attack, or the Muslim cavalry, exhausted from repeated charges that achieved nothing. By late afternoon, both armies were battered. Casualties on both sides were significant, thousands dead and wounded, the ground churned to mud and blood. But the Frankish lines still stood. And then Charles played his decisive card. He had held back a contingent of Frankish cavalry and infantry in reserve, not committed to the main battle. While the Muslim cavalry was focused on the Frankish center, Charles sent this force around the flank, through the forest, to attack the Umayyad camp, where the baggage train, plunder and non-combatants were lightly guarded. It was a calculated risk. If the raid failed, those troops would be wasted. If it succeeded, it would create chaos. It succeeded. The Frankish raiding force hit the Muslim camp, killing guards, setting fires, threatening the baggage train. Word spread through the Muslim army that their camp was under attack. For an army that had come for plunder, the threat of losing what they had already seized was unbearable. Units began pulling back from the main battle to protect the camp. Abdul Rahman saw his army beginning to fracture, soldiers disengaging without orders, cavalry retreating to defend the baggage. He rode forward, trying to rally his forces, to restore order, to get his men back into the fight. And somewhere in the chaos, Abdul Rahman was killed. The sources are unclear on exactly how. Some say he was killed by a Frankish soldier during the raid on the camp. Others say he was killed on the main battlefield trying to rally his troops. What matters is that the commander of the Umayyad army, the man whose authority held the diverse coalition of Arabs, Berbers, and Syrians together, was dead. The news spread through the Muslim ranks like wildfire. Without Abdul Rahman, there was no unified command. Different contingents began pulling back, not in coordinated retreat but in panicked flight. Some units tried to hold, fighting desperately as the Franks pushed forward. Others fled immediately, abandoning equipment, supplies, everything. Charles did not order a full pursuit. It was evening, his men were exhausted, and chasing a broken army through unfamiliar terrain in the dark was a recipe for ambush or disaster. The Franks held the battlefield, tended to their wounded, and prepared for the Muslims to regroup and attack again the next day. They didn't. During the night, the Umayyad army evacuated, leaving behind their camp, their wounded, their dead, and much of their baggage. They retreated south in disorder, harassed by Frankish and Aquitanian forces, losing more men to exhaustion, straggling, and local counterattacks. By the time the remnants of the army reached the Pyrenees, perhaps half of the force that had invaded was dead, captured, or missing. It was a catastrophic defeat. The casualties at Tours are impossible to calculate precisely. Medieval sources exaggerate wildly, with some claiming hundreds of thousands of Muslim dead, which is absurd. A reasonable estimate is that the Umayyads lost perhaps 10 to 15,000 killed on the battlefield and during the retreat, with thousands more wounded or captured. Frankish casualties were also significant, likely several thousand dead and many more wounded, but they held the field, which meant they could recover their wounded and bury their dead. Abdul Rahman's death was the critical loss. With him died the momentum of Umayyad expansion into Francia. The immediate aftermath saw Charles consolidate his victory politically. Aquitaine, which had been semi-independent, was brought firmly under Frankish control. Odo died a few years later, and Charles installed his own authority over the duchy. The monasteries and bishoprics that had been threatened showered Charles with praise, legitimizing his rule as divinely sanctioned. Charles used the victory to strengthen his position against internal rivals, crushing rebellions with the same efficiency he had shown against the Umayyads. By the time Charles died in 741, he had established a dynasty. His son Pepin would become king, overthrowing the last Merovingian. His grandson would be Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800, creating the Carolingian Empire that would dominate Western Europe for a century. Tours was the foundation of all of it. For the Umayyad Caliphate, Tours was a humiliation but not a mortal wound. The Caliphate remained powerful, controlling Al-Andalus for centuries, maintaining a sophisticated, wealthy civilization that would produce philosophers, poets, scientists, and architects whose works still stand. But Tours marked the limit of expansion in the West. There would be more raids into Francia over the next decades, but never again a full-scale invasion. The Pyrenees became the effective border between Christian and Muslim Europe. The failure to conquer Francia meant that Islam would not dominate Western Europe the way it dominated the Middle East and North Africa. Whether this was historically significant or just one battle among many is a question historians still debate. Some historians argue that Tours was one of the most important battles in history, the moment that preserved Christianity in Western Europe and prevented Islamic conquest that would have fundamentally altered European civilization. Edward Gibbon, the 18th-century historian, famously speculated that without Tours, the Umayyads might have conquered all of Europe, and the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford. It's a dramatic image, and it fit the narrative of Christian Europe defining itself against Islamic threat. But modern historians are more skeptical. They point out that the Umayyad invasion of 732 was a raid, not a planned conquest. Abdul Rahman's goal was plunder and possibly establishing a forward base, not occupying and governing Francia. The Umayyads were already overstretched, controlling an empire from Spain to Central Asia, dealing with internal rebellions and succession disputes. Even if they had won at Tours, holding Francia would have been logistically and militarily impossible. But here's the counter-argument. Battles matter not just for what they achieve, but for what they prevent and what they symbolize. Tours stopped a powerful army in its tracks and killed its commander. That sent a message to future would-be invaders that Francia was not easy prey. It emboldened Christian resistance in Spain and elsewhere. And it created a hero, Charles Martel, whose descendants would shape European history for centuries. If Abdul Rahman had won at Tours, if Charles had been killed and his army destroyed, would the Frankish kingdom have collapsed? Possibly. Would the Umayyads have continued pushing north, emboldened by victory? Possibly. We can't know because Tours didn't happen that way. What we know is that after Tours, the balance of power in Western Europe shifted decisively in favor of the Franks, and Islam did not spread beyond the Pyrenees. How did 30,000 Frankish infantry stop 60 to 70,000 Umayyad cavalry and infantry? Start with leadership. Charles Martel was a brilliant tactical commander who understood his strengths and his enemy's weaknesses. He knew Frankish infantry could hold ground, but could not maneuver against cavalry in open terrain. So he chose terrain that neutralized cavalry mobility, forced the Umayyads to attack uphill into a prepared position, and refused to be drawn out. His decision to hold back reserves and raid the Umayyad camp was strategically brilliant, creating panic at the moment the enemy was most vulnerable. Then, discipline. Frankish warriors stood for hours under repeated cavalry charges, something that requires training, cohesion, and willingness to endure punishment. Many armies would have broken after the first few charges. The Franks did not. That level of discipline suggests that Charles's army was not a hastily assembled levy, but a corps of experienced warriors who trusted their commander and each other. Tactics. The shield wall, the massed infantry formation, was the counter to cavalry. Horses will not charge into a solid wall of spears and shields unless forced, and even when forced, the momentum of the charge is absorbed by the mass of men. The Umayyad cavalry, designed for mobility and shock, found itself in a grinding attrition battle where their advantages were negated. They could not flank because of the terrain, they could not break through because of Frankish discipline, and they could not disengage without losing face and momentum, morale and motivation. The Franks were fighting for their homes, their churches, their civilization. The Umayyads were fighting for plunder and religious conquest, but they were far from home, in hostile territory, and when things went wrong, the coalition of Arabs and Berbers fractured. Abdul Rahman's death removed the unifying authority, and without it, the army disintegrated. Finally, logistics. The Umayyad army was massive, which was a strength in open battle, but a weakness in extended operations. Feeding 70,000 men and horses requires enormous supplies. The longer Abdul Rahman waited outside the Frankish position, the more his supplies dwindled. Charles, fighting on his own territory, had shorter supply lines and local support. The Franks could afford to wait. The Umayyads could not. The long-term consequences of Tours reshaped European political and religious geography. Christianity remained the dominant religion of Western Europe, and the cultural, philosophical, and political development of Europe followed a Christian trajectory. Whether that was good or bad depends on your perspective. Christian Europe would produce universities, Gothic cathedrals, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, but also the Inquisition, religious wars, colonialism, and genocide. Islamic civilization in Al-Andalus produced architectural wonders like the Alhambra, preserved classical learning, advanced science and medicine, but also practiced slavery, religious intolerance, and imperial conquest. Neither civilization was morally superior. Both were complex, contradictory, capable of brilliance and brutality. Tour meant that Western Europe would develop along Christian lines rather than Islamic ones. That's historically significant, even if we can't quantify exactly how significant. And here's the final irony. Charles Martel, the savior of Christian Europe, spent much of his career plundering churches and monasteries to fund his wars. He confiscated church lands, redistributed them to his warriors, and generally treated the church as a resource to be exploited. The clergy, grateful for his victory over the Muslims, conveniently overlooked his sacrilege. After his death, Charlemagne would reform the church, restore much of what Charles had taken, and be crowned emperor by the Pope. The Carolingian dynasty built its legitimacy on Tours, on the image of Charles as Christian defender, but the reality was messier. Charles was a pragmatist who used religion when convenient and ignored it when it was. That doesn't diminish his military genius or the significance of his victory. It just reminds us that history is complicated. But on October 10th, 732, on a battlefield somewhere between Tours and Poitiers, none of the long-term consequences mattered. What mattered was that 30,000 Frankish warriors stood in a shield wall and refused to break. What mattered was that Abdul Rahman was killed and his army shattered. What mattered was that the Umayyad tide, which had swept across 3 continents, crashed against the Franks and stopped. One battle, one day, one decision to stand and fight rather than retreat, and the future of Western Europe was secured. That's the story of Tours. No crusader mythology, no simple good versus evil, just tactics, terrain, and the brutal reality that sometimes discipline and determination can overcome overwhelming numbers. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. Share this with anyone who thinks medieval history is boring or that battles don't matter. Drop a comment telling me what you thought, what I missed, what medieval battle you want me to cover next. This is History Without the Filter, and we're just getting started.